Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Rabbling On podcast. We are on episode 5. How exciting. Now, before I proceed with this episode, I want to first apologise to all those who were so eager for me to release a new episode. I received a deluge of messages regarding the status of this latest episode. Well, you'll be happy to hear my voice again, because this is it. This will be a long one, as I can confirm that I have actually been working on this whilst, of course, doing my actual job. But I hope you enjoy nonetheless. And one more thing, for those who are carefully listening, you will have noticed that I've got music now. So, episode 5, the Russia-Ukrainian war. Something that's been in our news more or less every week without fail. And although focus was drawn away from the start of the conflict in the Middle East, it's still very much a topic of conversation, globally. And it's incredible to think that this has been going on for over 2 years now. I think the invasion was in February of 2022, so 2 years and a couple months. So as you can imagine, with that, lots to get through. But before I do that, I actually just want to a bit of self-congratulation here. I thought the first two topics, the first 4 topics I really spoke about have, of course, the conflict, the war in Palestine was obviously going to have a lot of sort of progression. But the other ones that I spoke about as well, I thought they ended up being quite. Well, there was more news about them at least. So we talked about university, and this one's probably the least well known. But if anyone has seen, there have been a few developments in terms of university. There's been a lot more attention in some of the newspapers about university, about the costs, etc. So they were listening to this podcast. I know people in the Telegraph were listening to this, and they decided to taken the inspiration and made their own report. Unfortunately, I wasn't given credit for that, which is fine. They wouldn't want to be seen as taking credit from some random person with 4 followers. So that's fine, but one day we'll get there. And then what was the other one? The conscription as well, and this kind of works in tandem with this episode, but as we have seen as well, in an attempt for good old Rishi Sunak to basically save his party, he decided to announce officially national service as part of the manifesto of the Conservative Party. So that was interesting. It wasn't met very well. As you can imagine, people were very upset by the thought. And I don't think it was delivered very well. And the time at which he was announcing it doesn't work well, because there are a lot of tensions with war going on, and for him to just then say, okay, well, we're going to have national service, people are like, hold on a minute, no way, old chap. So I don't think it's is it a good idea? It depends, but whatever my thoughts are, it's definitely come at a bad time, that's for sure. Will I think this will help with the Tories? No, not at all. I think they are doomed. And, well, we'll see the outcome of that. Anyway, so episode 5. So how I said that I was going to split this up. So the first episode, I think, given how this conflict has gone and maybe some of the things that have been said by whether it's by Putin, by Zelensky, or by some of the experts in the geopolitical sort of sphere, I thought it would be important to start with, and of course, being me, being a stickler for history, but give some historical background. So part 1 of this will be the history of Ukraine, but not just its history, it's the history and the relationship between Ukraine and Russia from the perspective of Ukraine, but also having in some of that important global events that happened that involve both Russia and Ukraine. And then part two will be more of the contemporary stuff from the outset of the war, what the reactions have been from global powers around the world, what the consequences of those have been, etc., etc. But without further ado, let's get cracking on this episode. If one were to summarize the cause of the Russia-Ukraine war, I surmise one would say something along the lines of the war was started due to the ambitions of a militaristic president and his band of rich but not so merry men. And I think that statement would be somewhat accurate, if not brief, summary of the cause of the conflict. However, if one also wanted to understand the various reasons why Putin invaded Ukraine, beyond the simple and, quite frankly, lazy explanation of, well, because he's a bloodthirsty war criminal, one will need to explore the very close history that Russia and Ukraine share. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what I'm going to do. So, Ukraine, first of all, is roughly situated or connected to the Eurasian steppe. Now, for those who don't know what this is, it's a vast swathe of flat land that stretches from East Asia, so think maybe like Mongolia, all the way across to East Europe. Basically, once the mountains start, so you could maybe say like the Carpathians up until there, roughly. The topography of this land makes it easy for grazing animals to roam, grazing animals being horses, deer, etc., providing an abundance of sources of food. This meant that, instead of places like Western Europe where people would settle, so think about the UK, France, Italy, we would have farms, homesteads. So instead of settling in locations, people who lived on the steppe, which was this huge expanse of land, would constantly move on horse. So they would pack up their tents. Oh, well, not their tents, because they didn't have tents then, but, their camps. And they would be moving around on horses, living for maybe months or maybe even years in one place at a time, but eventually moving on. And they would live off not the crops that they grew, but the animals that they caught in the wild, and therefore possessing very little farming knowledge. Given that as a fact that they were moving so much, and they were constantly on horses, it's not surprising to find out that it was in the Eurasian steppe where the horse was said to have been first domesticated as a means of obviously travelling. So it may also come as no surprise that the inhabitants of the steppe, who are generally referred to as nomads, were some of the best riders of their time. And due to a combination of the vast openness of the land and the skillfulness of the riders, I like to imagine the Eurasian steppe almost like a conveyor belt into Europe. Just super easy terrain. You can do it fast, direct route straight in from the steppe into Europe. To give an idea, if you imagine someone like Genghis Khan, who was a very famous but quite a ruthless ruler, it's said that he could deliver one message across his entire empire in 4 days. Each rider could ride something like 250 miles a day, which is incredible. They would have multiple horses, ponies, I think they were ponies, and they would just ride. They were these super durable ponies, and they would ride for the whole day. They would pass a message on to some other person. That message would then be relayed on. So, these guys we're not just talking about, they were good at riding horses. These guys, it was, they probably spent more time on a horse than they did on their own feet. So they're incredible riders, and they mastered the art of archery from horseback. Their accuracy with a bow on a horse is said to be incredible. Something like, apparently they could hit a marmot in the skull from over like 200 meters away on horseback, which is just incredible. So that's the sort of idea that I'm trying to give you about how much these people sort of relied on horses. So, commencing in sort of like the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, there were a handful of Greek colonies that emerged along the northern expanse of the Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula, and the Sea of Azov. By the way, if anyone is sort of curious about the locations of these areas that I'm speaking about, just pause it, have a look on Google, see what I'm talking about, and then it sort of gives you a better idea then. So these Hellenic settlements eventually, that were there for a while under the sort of the Greek hegemony, eventually these settlements fell under the sphere of influence that was exerted by the Roman Empire after Rome obviously became the leading power in Europe and parts of the Middle East, which was a long time, but obviously I'm not going to go into that detail. Across the first millennium BCE, the hinterland of the steppe witnessed successive occupations by the Cimmerians, the Scythians, and the Sarmatians. All people who were of Iranian lineage, but all very separate. They were separate in terms of the sort of tribes that they came from. So it saw successive sort of rulers of the land, but all of them maintained robust commercial and cultural ties with these Greek colonies. Now, around 200 BCE, there was an epoch of tribal and ethnic migrations that unfolded with the southward descent of the Goths, who were originally from the Baltic region. So they came down south into what is now known as the Ukrainian territories. And their incursion south resulted in the displacement of the Sarmatians, who I just said were the sort of last people of the Iranian lineage there. But the Goths' ascendancy was abruptly, sort of curtailed around 375 by the thrust eastward from the Huns, both of whom, the Huns and the Goths, famously played a part in the destruction of the Roman Empire. The Goths obviously split between the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, and the Huns sort of eventually split up as well, but both of those had their own turn at, taking a stab at the dying dog that was the Roman Empire. So the ensuing 5th and 6th centuries witnessed an influx of the Bulgars and the Avars, who were both Slavs. And then from the 7th to the 9th centuries, the Ukrainian steppe assumed a role within the expansive Turkic Khazar Empire, who were largely a mercantile empire. And this was centralized around the lower Volga River. Now, this Khazar dominion encountered severe disruption in the late 9th century with the coming of the Magyars, who were basically, or you would now call them, I guess, Hungarians. And then successive to their presence in the 10th and the 11th centuries, witnessed the ascendancy of the Pechenegs, who held sway over substantial portions of southern Ukraine, who subsequently yielded the land to the, and I'm going to get this wrong probably because I find it a difficult word to say. I believe it's pronounced the Polovetzians. Luckily, we also call them the Cumans, which is a lot easier. And these tribes, or whatever you want to call them, they were actually, again, they were all somewhat related to each other distantly. But coming from different tribes, effectively, they were succeeded. If anyone has ever watched the TV series Vikings, both the original and the sequel, they introduce this area, especially the Pechenegs, it obviously in a entertaining fashion, but it is also somewhat accurate. And I think as well, there's a few games where they talk about these people. You don't really hear much about this sort of area. I think there's a game where there are like humans as well. But yeah, it's so if you are interested in that, Vikings, as much as it is theatrical, there are quite a few historical accuracies in that show, which I will actually be mentioning a few of those characters. So again, if you have seen that, you probably recognize some of the names, or maybe some games as well, I'm sure. But throughout this era, which was punctuated by nomadic incursions, and based on what I've just said, there were lots. The survival of a few Greek settlements on the Crimean Peninsula, notably the Chersonese, which is modern-day Sevastopol, depended upon the patronage which was extended to them by the Byzantine Empire. I just want to add, by the way, for some of these pronunciations of these areas, such as Chersonese, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's, you see a lot of stuff when you're doing the research, you see these names, but you don't know if you're actually pronouncing it correctly or not. I believe it's Chersonese. It could be Chersonese, maybe. I don't know. Let's go with Chersonese. Actually, that sounds more accurate. Anyway, so as I sort of digress slightly, meanwhile, all these movements were going on. At the same time, influenced by the Germanic migrations, the Slavic tribes initiated their own movement from their original homeland, which was north of the Carpathians, during the 5th and 6th centuries. So while some Slavs migrated westward, further west, and others headed south into the Balkans, the East Slavs established themselves in the forest and the forest steppe regions, which now largely encompasses western and north-central Ukraine, as well as southern Belarus. And their expansion extended northward and northeastward into areas that would later constitute the sort of core of the Russian state, which is obviously centered around Moscow. Now, a lot of the migration that I just talked about, and you could go into so much detail about all of those. All I've literally done is given you like the names and of who's gone where. It would be a lot easier if I could maybe you could have like a map and you could just draw it, but I don't have that capability yet. But a lot of the migration around Europe was caused by two main factors. One being, as I said before, the influx of nomads from the east, who had pushed the Eastern Europeans further west, and it basically just created this massive shift. People needing to move elsewhere, whether it was out of fear of people. Part of it was, okay, you've got these people coming east, and then you had the people and they were arriving east, and those people were moving further west because they were afraid, and as they moved further west, they were fighting with the people already living there, almost like a domino effect. And the second was due to the collapse of the Roman Empire, which in part was due to the exact migration of these tribes, but also due to many internal issues that the Roman Empire had. I mean, at this point, it had been going on for so long, bound to fail. But, a lot of, so the migration itself, it was very complicated, super interesting though. And, people say, they say something like for every 200 people, one person could date their lineage back to Genghis Khan. One, obviously, due to the fact that he was a bit of a menace. But two, just due to the massive migration that people had, all this movement of people just creates this really diverse sort of gene pool of people. Meaning that, if you're from, I don't know, Romania, are you really just Romanian? Or I mean, I would love to see the what do you call this DNA test that people do around this area, and it would just be some fantastic mix of absolutely everywhere. And so, I mean, it kind of feeds into that question of where you're really from, because if you're European, you definitely have some Eastern, nomadic blood in you for sure. Even as far as the UK, although probably less so. But it was definitely there for sure. Anyway, so engaging in agricultural and animal husbandry practices, East Slavs also participated in domestic industries such as cloth making and ceramics. They erected fortified settlements, many of which evolved into significant commercial and political centres. Now, of course, remember, as I was saying before, these people that coming from the east, they were not settling tribes. So when they did come across these settlements, like the Mongolians, they razed the places to the ground, like entirely. In some places, he completely destroyed so much culture, etc. So when they came across these places, they were like, well, what the hell is this? Get rid of that. We want to see it flattened so we can ride our horses across it. But eventually, as people came further west, they started to sort of surrender that nomadic lifestyle and started to settle. And in some cases, they would create their own. Other cases, they would sort of mix with other cultures. But the ones that were staying, they erected these fortified settlements, and as I said, they ended up being significant commercial and political centres. Noteworthy among these early settlements was Kiev, which was situated on the elevated right bank, Dnieper River. And so, these migrations played an important role, as I was sort of alluding to before, in shaping the identity of those who became known as sort of Kievans, who became Slavic people. These people, once you have an area which is sort of seen as a bit of a commercial centre, more people flock to it, and eventually, through just natural assimilation of people and a culture, they became known as Kievan, who were a Slavic people. Now, the legend has it that Kiev was founded by three brothers, and the pronunciations I could get wrong again, but one of them was Ki, one of them was Shek, and one of them was Koriv. And they were all leaders of an Eastern Slavic tribe. I believe they were called the Polyanian tribe. Again, difficult to tell. This, as I said, it was a legend, so who knows how true this actually is. But each of these three brothers established their own settlement on a hill, and these settlements became known as the town of Kiev, which is named after the elder brother, the first one, Ki. Now, if we sort of fast forward, or just sort of take a sidestep on the history of this area, and we start to look at the Vikings. Now, the Viking diaspora had a profound impact on European history and genealogy, as did people coming from the east. And whilst it's more commonly known that the Vikings mixed with the Anglo-Saxons, and I say mixed very tentatively, they invaded and they raped and they pillaged, and also more closely with the Franks, who later became known as the Normans, due to the mixing of the Frankish and the Viking blood. It's a lesser known fact that the Russian and Ukrainians also share strong hereditary ties to these effectively sea raiders. Now, once the Vikings started to leave their homeland, which was for various reasons, I won't get into those, but there are a few reasons why they started to explore. So they were exploring both east and west. So the Viking traders sailed the river routes between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, because these rivers they're quite navigable waterways. And these rivers would pass through what is today Ukraine. Now, from there, once they did travel down these rivers, some became mercenaries selling their swords to the Byzantine Empire. And these mercenaries became known as the famous Varangian Guard, who were an elite bodyguard unit to the emperors of the Byzantine Empire. Which is funny because, you think, yes, the Vikings actually protected the Romans, which is something when you actually take a step back, that doesn't really make any sense. The Vikings protected the Romans. Although some would argue they weren't actually Romans. That's up for debate whether you believe that or not. I'm not here to judge on that argument today. Other Vikings actually went further east and attacked the Persians from the Caspian Sea. Now, if you think about those two things, the Vikings protecting the Romans and the Vikings attacking the Persians, and if you're a fan of history, it seems quite a strange concept Because, when I visualize Vikings, if I had to say Viking, I'm sure most of you thought of men with axes raiding, cold to mild climates, such as England, or living in Norway, traveling out of these fjords. Not the sweltering heat of what I would associate Persia with. I can't imagine Vikings with these fur coats, these axes, and those helmets knocked with horns that they wore in the heat that is sort of the Persian Empire. Anyway, so around modern day Kiev, many of the Swedish traders began to settle. Well, I say Swedish, but Norse, let's say. They began to settle, and this was very typical of Vikings. What they did is, when they came to England, they effectively wanted land there because they saw it as a lot more arable. They wanted to make a new settlement for themselves. That sort of became known as the Danelaw in England. Again, as I said, they were the Normans in France. And they were referred to by the local population, the Kievans. The Kievans referred to them as Rus. And Rus roughly translates to men who row. And this was essentially the Kievan version for the word Viking. Now, Viking, a lot of people get this wrong because people assume Viking was a race of people, but Viking was actually a profession. There are two. The origins of the word Viking is quite. It's not as clear as you might think. It's not as clear as something like I don't know, nomad. Which a nomad was someone who'd Viking. It's it's like an adjective and a noun, and a Viking was the profession, I believe, originally. But anyway, so the Kievans, they call these people the Rus, but the name Rus obviously refers to the fact that they are associated with the rivers which they rowed down and the rowboats themselves. So these Rus people merged with, or more accurately, they conquered other regional ethnic tribes of the Slavs, the Finns and the Baltics, most notably in Kiev and Novgorod. Now, there was a chap called Oleg, and he was a Viking/Varangian who was a prince of Novgorod, and he later took control of Kiev and made it the capital of this new territory. And it was here that the state became known as the Kievan Rus. Now, these Kievan Rus, who are obviously a combination of Vikings or Rus and Slavic Kievan Rus, these tribes are the ancestors of the Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. Now, if you think about, and I guess you can't really, well, the name Rus is spelled R-U-S. And if you think about how Russia is spelled, it's R-U-S-S-I-A, and then Belarus is Belarusian, so Belarusian, Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian. Now, there's no R-U-S in Ukraine, but you can kind of see where the origin of the name comes from. So, prior to this Oleg, he was quite a famous Viking, there was a Varangian, just purely a Varangian ruler, Viking ruler, named Rurik. And he was, once he had sailed down this area in this new sort of Ukrainian territory, he was invited to govern, who were, basically this mob of people who had previously overthrown another overlord who was also Varangian. And for some reason they thought by replacing one Viking with another, their problems would be solved. Anyway, so Rurik did just that. He obliged, and he eventually settled in Novgorod. I always get this pronunciation wrong. Novgorod. And he settled there with his two brothers, and they settled in northern Ukraine, what is now northern Ukraine, and two other followers of his would go on to capture Kiev. Now, when Rurik died, he entrusted Novgorod to his son, Igor, who is another sort of famous person. Now, this successful family line became known as the Rurikid dynasty, and they lasted for quite a long time. And I believe it went from the Rurikid dynasty straight to the Romanov dynasty. Now, I could be wrong with that. I'm not entirely sure, but I do believe it went from the Rurikids to the Romanovs. But anyway, notable leaders of the Rurikid dynasty were Vladimir the Great, who famously converted from paganism to Orthodox Christianity. Ivan the Great, who famously freed the Rus from the Mongols. And Ivan the Terrible, who needs no description. So Kiev became known as the mother of Rus cities, and it was the hub of the Kievan Rus people and the capital of the Kievan Rus state. And the rulers of Kiev were known as the Grand Princes of Kiev. So, as you can imagine, Kiev, which is obviously modern day of the same name, Kiev in Ukraine, is significant as it's seen as the root of the Russian people and the Belarusian people and anyone of those of that sort of genealogy. So now let's fast forward to 1223, and I know what I said before prior to when talking about the nomads when I referred to the Mongols. The Mongols did come after a lot of the initial eastward expansion. Well, certainly in Ukraine anyway, but I was just using those as an example of a nomadic people. But in 1223, the Mongol invasion of Europe took place, which was similar to that of the Huns, which I had mentioned before. Not to get confused, because I mean, if you think about it, effectively what had happened was they were nomadic people from east. They came west with their tactics of horseback riding, shooting with arrows from the back of a horse, and they settled in this area. And then hundreds of years later, the exact same people, not the exact same people, but people from a similar area, came across again to these now settled people, but who were once nomadic people. So the Mongol invasion took place, and there was a famous battle called the Battle of the Kolka River, which saw the Mongols victorious. And for some reason that I'm not too sure of, whilst they did win that battle, which basically meant they had control of the land, they did leave, but they shortly returned and conquered the lands of the Kievan Rus. Now, if you imagine the Mongols came and we have these established settlements of the Kievan Rus, you had the Grand Princes of Kiev, lines were drawn in terms of who owned what. But under the control of the Mongols, or as they were known as the Golden Horde, the Kievan Rus state became fractured. As I said before, in fact, the Mongols completely destroyed the capital. I don't know if they had some innate hatred for buildings because they constantly moved, but it was a common trait that they would just, anything that had bricks and mortar, they just wanted to bring it down. Maybe they just didn't like mountains or anything that seemed like an obstacle for horses, so they just dragged it down. I don't know. But they destroyed the capital. And this ruling of the area and the fracturing of the different sort of areas that were set in their own jurisdictions, this brought about the birth of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which was in the bounds of the former Kievan Rus state. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about how these things started, otherwise, honestly, I would be here for absolutely hours. But this place Moscow became the new epicenter of the Rus people, and the first prince of the Grand Duchy of Moscow was, and forgive me for the pronunciation of this, Danil Alexandrovich, and the last being Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible was actually the last Grand Duchy of Moscow, but he also became the first Tsar of Russia, and we know how the story of the Tsars goes after that. But once Genghis Khan had died, his vast empire didn't survive him that much longer, or at least not in its original form. And in the breakup of this empire, Kiev was absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which shared a similar history to the Grand Duchy of Moscow. You know, these new areas started to spring up, and once that old empire had gone through, they started to claim as much land as possible. And it was then later absorbed into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So that sort of describes how these areas that we know of today, Moscow, Kiev, Lithuania, Poland, we're starting to see how these areas came about initially, although very briefly. But another sidestep, I want to talk about a people, and these people were called the Cossacks. Now, the Cossacks are an important race of people when referring to the history of Ukraine. In fact, I don't think you can talk about the history of Ukraine without talking about the Cossacks. They are Ukraine. And maybe without realizing, you've probably seen some Cossack heritage before. If you look at the Ukrainian boxer whose name escapes me, what's his name? Goodness, what is his name? Anyway, he's the light heavyweight / heavyweight boxer. When I remember his name, I'll say it. He sometimes wears traditional Ukrainian clothes, and these are actually clothes of the Cossacks. So undoubtedly, when you discuss the Alexander Usyk is his name, for goodness sake, I can't believe I didn't get that. Anyway, where was I? Yeah, so when you are discussing Ukrainian history, culture, language, identity, food, whatever, the Cossacks are definitely the most significant. So to briefly summarize the Cossacks, during the rule of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the lands of East Ukraine were largely unpopulated, uncivilized flatlands which sort of bordered the Crimean Khanate, which was effectively an offspring state of what was once the lands of the Golden Horde. So once the Golden Horde sort of left, or they died, whatever, there were still remnants of people who stayed in the area. And the Crimean Khanate were one of those people. They share a similar or a close, genealogical heritage. And so you had this, empty land where no one really lived in, and if the people that did live there, it was kind of just like these hostile militaristic tribes, enclaves of tribes. And the Crimean Khanate saw the land as rightfully theirs, and obviously their claim deriving from the Golden Horde. And as such, they would frequently raid the land, which made it a very unstable, very hostile frontier for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So to counter this and secure their border, the Lithuanians built a number of strategically placed forts along the border, which were garrisoned with mercenaries of Tatar, Turkic, but also Slavic origin. However, due to the distance from, Lithuanian civilization and an already large degree of independence, because once they built these areas, they sort of said, okay, you defend it, it's all down to you, good luck, see you later. So these people had a large degree of independence. So much so, in fact, that these forts started to develop their own militaristic communities, and they saw themselves sort of separate from the rest. And with tax incentives from aristocrats of the eastern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, peasants also began to migrate to the western part of the Commonwealth to live in this land and develop this land. Basically, what they wanted to do was send enough people there that it became settlement big enough, people would grow, and they could expand the empire merely through population growth. So once these peasants moved there, the Polish and the Lithuanians tried to reimpose their authority on these new communities, who had at this point become accustomed to their freedom. So these peasants turned basically these peasants, they were peasants, and they became free men. They started to integrate with the other communities along the border, these militaristic communities along the border, and they left behind their farming lifestyle, and they started to roam the land, living off the land as hunters and brigands. It sort of going back to what the old lifestyle was like, when we had the Huns come over, and the opportunity to escape the serfdom of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which obviously was also very commonplace within Europe at this time, spread across the land, and more people started to make that journey further towards the west. What I think is very interesting about this is that it wasn't actually just peasants who would later make their way over to the east. They went from west to east. They didn't go east. They went to east. So it wasn't just peasants who would make their way over to the east, but it would also be maybe nobles, maybe disgraced nobles, or nobles with no money. But that group would include nobles, and it would also include priests. So people of quite high status in society. So initially, at least, being a Cossack wasn't connected to a race or a nation, but rather a community that shared a lifestyle for freedom. And this is where the sort of the Cossack heritage began. It was these people that would move further out east and live together in a community, defending themselves from other tribes, but also having an independent lifestyle, roaming the land, etc. But I think this sort of idea of freedom was very important to them. As well, at this point, a Ukrainian identity hadn't started to emerge. There was no such thing as Ukraine at this point. But a Cossack identity started to emerge. So really, Cossacks predate Ukraine. But to describe the situation at this point, the Cossacks had emerged in the wildlands of the eastern part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, but by the aristocracy, the upper class, or the administrations and the institutions of the Commonwealth, these people were viewed as vagrants of the empire, and they were settling in land that did not belong to them strictly. However, they also proved to be useful to the Commonwealth, as they were a buffer between the eastern part of the empire, or really a buffer for the empire, and the Crimean Khanate, who I said earlier would regularly raid into the land, and if unchecked, they would take the land for themselves, and they would raid further east, as they believed the claim to the land was theirs. So the Cossack community were really a double-edged sword, and that would actually continue to be the case for quite some time, as they both regularly fought with and against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the various wars, not just with the Crimean Khanate, but also other players, let's say, within the region. Now, this precarious relationship led to a significant development in Ukrainian history, when in 1649, and just obviously given that date, I've just glossed over a lot of things here. Otherwise, again, it would be, I'm not going to give a definitive history of the area, just important things that happened. In 1649, a coalition of Cossack and Crimean Tatars fought and won the Battle of Zborov against the Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth. As a result of the war, the Cossack Hetmanate was born, which became an official state, and very significantly for them, this state also included the very important city of Kiev. So the Cossacks had indeed won their independence and formed their own state, the Cossack Hetmanate. However, as many cases have demonstrated in history, whether it be from Spartacus and the Romans to the Kurdish state post-World War II, winning your freedom and maintaining your freedom are two very different things and require very different people. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fought back against the Cossacks to regain the territory they lost. The Cossacks, realising the need to form alliances with other people to maintain their independence, first attempted to form a coalition with the Ottomans. However, they were too busy fighting their own war. They then tried to maintain their alliance with the Crimean Khanate, but the Tatars were conscious of not letting their new allies, but more importantly their neighbour, from becoming too strong, which was definitely wise, because you can imagine them, once realising they have the upper hand, turning around and saying, well, thanks for your help, but it's your turn next. Therefore, the Cossacks approached the Russian Empire under the wing of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, which had been forming a large identity from similar ethnic states. So the request made by the Cossacks to the Russians became known as the Treaty of Pereyaslav, and the Cossacks signed this in 1654, which officially saw the Cossacks swear loyalty to the Russian state under Tsar Alexei, who at this point was of the Romanov dynasty. So we've let the Rurikids are gone, and in come the famous Rurikids have gone, in come the famous Romanovs. An interesting point of this treaty, the Treaty of Pereyaslav, the USSR had actually used this as propaganda, this treaty, as they referred to it as the act that reunified all the Rus people under a Tsar, under a Russian ruler. But it was significant, as it was the first time that what would loosely be described as a Ukrainian state had approached Russia, wanting some form of unity and or protection or assistance. But the story doesn't stop there. This wasn't the moment that created the bond. No. After a failed revolt that the Cossacks, within the Cossack Hetmanate, that the Cossack believed was orchestrated by the Russian Tsarist regime, they broke ties with the Russians and went back to the Polish Commonwealth, which accepted them in the Treaty of Hadiak in 1658. So 4 years have gone by being with the Russians, which recognised the Cossack Hetmanate as a third co-equal in the Commonwealth between the Poles, the Lithuanians, and now the new Cossacks. But this ultimately failed as well. The Cossacks were not happy here either, and they sort of kept on switching sides, and this flip-flopping between sides continued with the Cossacks. But as they did that, every time they did that, they lost more territory and more autonomy, effectively every time they did switch, and they switched quite a few times. When the Muscovy-Polish War concluded in 1667, both sides carved up what had remained of the Cossack Hetmanate, which at this point had already reduced in size significantly, in the Treaty of Andrusovo, or Andrusovo, I don't know which one. With Poland taking everything on the right side of the river Dnieper, and the Russians taking everything on the left of the river. So after all the allegiances, changing sides and land transfer, that really brings an end to the history of the Cossack state, where it gets carved up in a war between two bigger states. Except it doesn't. But because this is not supposed to be a definitive history of Ukraine, I'm going to bypass all the other small details, but details that happen in this time, which are significant in Ukrainian history, but not enough for me to sort of mention it here. But ultimately, the Cossack Hetmanate did regain some autonomy. However, they were largely a vassal state under Russia. fighting many wars on behalf of Peter the Great of Russia before the famous Ivan Mazepa of the Cossacks switched sides to join the Swedish King Charles the 12th, I believe, and attacked Russia in the Great Northern War. And he did this, though they switched sides after Mazepa felt betrayed by Tsar Peter by the fact that he had failed to protect the Cossack lands from an invasion. Ultimately, Mazepa felt his hand was forced into this action, but this was ultimately the demise of a truly independent hetmanate, and it was Catherine the Great who would finally absorb the Cossack state into Russia in 1767, stating, and I quote, "Cossack Ukraine should be Russified in the easiest way possible, so that it ceases to look like a wolf in the forest, and once the hetmans are gone from Little Russia, every effort should be made to eradicate their memory, let alone promote anyone to that office." That office obviously referring to the Hetman office. Another important development in that area was Crimea. Now, it had been a khanate of the Ottoman Empire, and it briefly became independent following a series of wars between the Ottoman Empire and Russia, before also being annexed by Catherine the Great in 1783. Importantly, this wasn't resisted by the locals of Crimea, who were the Tatars, and was also recognized by the Ottomans. So now that Russia had successfully merged Ukraine into their empire and took control of the very important Crimean Peninsula, so could begin the integration of these two not so dissimilar people. Now, as compensation for their lost rights as a ruling elite in the Hetmanate, the Cossack upper class, so to speak, the upper class, were raised to equal status within the Russian nobility. Many entered the imperial service of Russia, and some achieved the highest government ranks possible within the empire. Thus, through education, intermarriage, and government service, the Ukrainian nobility gradually became more Russified. However, many still harboured a strong sense of Cossack heritage, and this never really went away. By the 19th century, a Ukrainian identity really began to emerge, which was, of course, linked to the region's Cossack heritage. By that time, Russians considered Ukrainians and Belarusians as ethnic Russians, but referred to them as Little Russians. And in fact, in that quote I said from Catherine before, Catherine the Great, she also mentioned the term Little Russians. But this surge in Ukrainian identity likely began thanks to, not surge, it was probably more of a resurgence in a Ukrainian identity. Likely began thanks to academic developments among the people within the region. So in 1805, a university was established in Ukraine, and two more in 1834 in Kiev and 1865 in Odessa. Now, all these names you'll be familiar with based on what's happening in the war. Here in these universities, they promoted the study of local history, of the language and culture, all of which spurred a nationalist sentiment within the Ukrainian Cossack culture. But supposedly it was the literature which was the real driver of this resurgence of nationalism, with works introducing the idea of a free, democratic Ukrainian state. Now, due to the growing Ukrainian sentiment, separatist movement, Ukrainian independent sentiment, the Russian Empire introduced a series of draconian bans to curb this resurgence. They introduced a ban on schools teaching the Ukrainian language, as well as anything published in Ukrainian, be it books or newspapers. Stage performances as well, they were also banned. There are plenty of sort of good resources out there about the Cossacks, and I do believe they have a very interesting story. It's one of constant struggle, and ultimately there was success, but not without years and years of just being this, floating between these different allegiances, trying to carve out your own small nation. Something very unique about Cossack society was that during that period, of their sort of early foundations, they were actually incredibly democratic in stark comparison to much of Europe, which was dominated by monarchies. In the Ukrainian society, in the Cossack society, the hetman, a lot of it was about voting, who becomes sort of the head of the state. And if you consider that with all the, as I said, the monarchies and the feudalism that was in Europe, not so much by the 19th century, but before that, they had the idea of some form of democratic society way before it reached Western Europe, which is, I think it's super interesting. Although obviously, when I say Western Europe, I don't, obviously the Greeks and the Romans had it before, but once we had feudal society, way after the Romans and the Greeks had their democracies, the Cossacks, they had theirs. So it's not to say that Europe hadn't had it before, but at a period where a lot of places in Europe had they had absolute monarchies, they had some form of, democratic society. Now, fast forward to quite an important event in both Ukrainian and Russian history. Certainly gives good background knowledge to the importance of the area, was the famous Crimean War between 1853 and 1856. Now, supposedly the war the war started when the Ottoman Empire declared war on the Russian Empire, and there were many reasons why this war was declared, why the Ottomans did declare war against the Russians, but it's said the main reason is supposedly due to religious reasons, although I suspect that maybe they were masked as religious reasons. But the story itself is actually quite funny. So as it goes, it's Good Friday in Jerusalem, 1846. Priests and pilgrims alike gather round a church, praying around the site of Christ's crucifixion. So it's a very holy place, the most holy place, really. Typically, Holy Week for Catholic Christians and Orthodox Christians falls on separate weeks. The times they separate it is different. But this particular year, it's the same week. So effectively, if you think about all these Christians, whether Catholic or Orthodox, they make the pilgrimage to this place to celebrate this holy day, this holy week. So it's going to be very busy. Couple that with the fact that not only do you have half of Catholic Christendom there, you also have half of Orthodox Christendom there as well. So it's effectively double the number of what it would be during a week where it would already be full. The Orthodox priests arrive in the church first, laying their altar cloth on the altar, presumably ready to give an Orthodox service. The Catholic priests arrive swiftly after with their altar cloth, but they are enraged to see the Orthodox priests have already laid their cloth. So they approach the altar and they try to pull it off. An argument ensues where they both claim that they were given the right over the other by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire himself. Remember, at this point, the area is still owned or run by the Ottoman Empire. Now, being men of the cloth, despite their devotedness, in the house of God, a situation like this can be easily diffused. However, it's reported, and I'm not making this up, it's reported that a monk lands a clean hook on one of the Orthodox priest's chin and drops him Apparently, that's what happens. He punches him. Obviously, I'm making this a bit more theatric. But this monk lands one on the Orthodox priest's chin and drops this guy like a sack of spuds. Immediately, without hesitation, a massive brawl breaks out, and all of the pious men in the church start haymaking, upon the opposite faction, just throwing bombs. Holy men turn into prime George Foreman, and they're just throwing some bombs left and right. It got to the point where people were picking up crucifixes and candlesticks and laying into literally anyone within a 2-meter vicinity of them. There were hired bodyguards of the pilgrims, and these hired bodyguards, seeing this, present their melee weapons and just start tanning people left and right again. It's literally anyone who's in my area is going to get it. Apparently, a priest even picks up an incense burner, if you know what that is. Those things that they swing from side to side. Apparently, so a priest picks up one of these incense burners and he starts swinging it like he's about to throw a slingshot. He's just anyone who's in next to me, you're going to get it on the head. So he's just swinging this incense burner on the top of his head. So priests and pilgrims alike are laid out on the floor, and it got so bad that people even draw their pistols and it becomes a shootout. So by all accounts, it is carnage in there. And by the time the authorities get there and they regain control, 40 people are dead. You got to remember, these people, these pistols, they'll be like these, flintlock pistols. So it's a one-shot matter. Discard that, and then if you've got something in your hands, present that. If not, just start throwing. Anyway, so 40 people are dead. This is how bad it got. Now, France used to have custody of many of the churches in Jerusalem. But after the French Revolution, France in general turned their backs on religion, to a degree at least. And the Orthodox Church, seeing this opportunity, replaced them in that power vacuum of the churches in the area. However, when the French returned, the Orthodox and Catholic churches often clashed. Now, Nicholas I, who was the Russian Tsar, saw himself as the legal protector of Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, who were actually, to be fair, victims of oppression and sometimes massacres. But he also used this position as a vehicle to expand Russian influence. However, Napoleon III, who was recently crowned Emperor of the French and founder of the Second French Empire, so Napoleon III was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was, the Napoleon. Napoleon III, he wanted this position instead, but he supported the Catholics. The reason he wanted it was because his position as emperor was not very secure, and he relied on the support of the traditional Catholics in France, as they had helped him ascend the throne. So to maintain their support and also to re-establish French authority in Europe and probably globally, he saw this title of protector of all Christians at holy sites as a very strategic one to elevate France back to the status of which they once had. And with this dispute about which clergyman should have access to the Church of Nativity, this was a good opportunity for Napoleon and France, I should say, to really gather support. And with enough political pressure and evidence of a treaty from the pre-French Revolution that granted France the right to govern the holy sites, and the main key to the church, which is who effectively gained access to the Church of Nativity was the main key, the Ottomans eventually bestowed that title back to Napoleon and France. Now this obviously upset Nicholas III, and he then put his own pressure on the Ottomans. And after some flip-flopping from the Ottomans due to the pressure exerted on him by both the Russians and the French, Tsar Nicholas eventually decided that enough was enough and he was going to invade the Ottomans. Now, as you can imagine, there is a lot of political intrigue in the approach to this war, and the main participants in the war, Britain, France, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, and to a lesser degree Sardinia, were all playing the proverbial game of chess. This war was a very famous war, with notable events such as the Battle of Balaclava, the Battle of Orma, and the Siege of Sevastopol, and Florence Nightingale's experiences of war, which led to the professionalisation of nursing in the British Empire. But the important part for this episode is not so much the battles themselves and some of the things that were a result of it, but the outcome of the war itself. Because Russia had lost the war, and the main battlefield was in Crimea. Russia, therefore, had lost part of their territory in modern-day Ukraine. However, in exchange for ceding their claim of being the protector of Christians living in the Ottoman Empire, they would be handed back the lost towns of Sevastopol, Balaclava, Kinburn, and other towns in and around the area of Crimea. And by the way, I'm not joking, there is actually a place in Ukraine called Kinburn, which sounds like the most Scottish town you can ever think of. And for some reason, completely unbeknownst to me, there is a town in Ukraine called Kinburn. But yeah, so these towns in and around the area of Crimea were handed back. Now, I think had this area not been handed back to the Russians, this would have had a major impact on the relationship between Russia and Ukraine today. But, that is pure speculation. The Black Sea, as a result of the war, was also demilitarized, which was then, as it is still now, of significant naval importance to Russia, as it is the only year-round seaport that gives Russia access to the waters, trading, for them to do their, trading. And so, this was signed in the Treaty of Paris in 1856. Now, the Crimean War itself, just sort of maybe a slight digression here. The Crimean War itself, even though it's nowhere near as well known as, like the First World War or the Second World War, some historians do call it World War Zero. And they describe it as a very important war for leading up to the First World War, which obviously had an impact on the Second. But it was the first of many in this war, in the Crimean War. First of all, it was the first war to use the telegram, obviously, which would have been means of communication between lines and the top brass in HQ or whatever. First war to be pictured for the public to see, which is where the public opinions about war and how the countries approach war, and how it sort of helped Florence Nightingale argue her point about a professional nursing service as well. It was the first time in a major war that the railroad was used, and it was one of the first wars where steamboats were also used extensively. The rifled firearms replaced the muskets here as well, so many important technological advances here. But it was, post-war at least, it was also a period of reflection for all of the European countries involved regarding leadership and professionalization of the army, because they realized that, especially like Russia, a lot of their stuff was outdated. And so, post-war, one of the significant things for Russia and indeed Ukraine was a series of reforms that were introduced as part of their national reflection. And this was mainly driven by the humiliation of defeat and quite an unnerving realization that they were behind many of the other European countries in terms of their overall development and innovation of technology. Tsar Alexander II finally abolished serfdom, which was effectively bonded slavery, and he took this as a warning sign to finally address the failing economy. His wish was the pivot of Russia away from an agricultural society and to join other European superpowers in becoming an industrial power. So with the abolition of serfdom and a process of land redistribution took place as a result of his new reforms, but this was done in a very laissez-faire manner and was left in charge of corrupt government officials and landowners who likely looked after each other in the process. So it wasn't that effective. But Alexander also set out to essentially decentralize the governance of the empire, allowing for more local bodies to have more governing power or have some form of governing power. Despite this, many people were still quite dissatisfied with the reforms, and they believed that they didn't go far enough. And after some years of growing dissent and a reverse of liberal policies by Alexander II, the Tsar was assassinated in 1881 by a radical group called Narodnaya Volnya, or the People's Will, and they blew him up. So he went out quite nicely. I kind of like to view that assassination as a precedent for being set for events that would take place almost 40 years later, which obviously would be the Russian Revolution and the brutal killing of the Tsars. But for the moment, the significance of this was that his successor, Alexander III, filled with rage at this assassination, reversed all the reforms his father introduced and became even more tyrannical. He expanded the Russification across the empire, which saw even more suppression of the Ukrainian culture, not just Ukrainian but other minorities, and he did this effectively all across the empire. Now, if we fast forward to the Russian Revolution, that is a topic, an event that is a beast in and of itself. As we all know, it had massive implications for not just Russian history, but also European history, and sets the precedent for what's to come, what we can expect from the Russian nation, more or less up until today, really. So I will provide a very concise yet helpful summation of this event. It happened. But what is critical to Ukraine's history during this period was that in 1917, Ukraine actually briefly became an independent nation again. Now, obviously, at this point, in 1917, we are coming to the end of the, or not quite coming to the end of, but we're still doing in the middle of the First World War, but sort of the latter part of the years at least. And, the powers had been fighting. You've got Britain, France against Germany. Russia were also massively involved in the war as well. But in 1917, and quite frankly throughout the whole war, attempts were made by the Austro-Hungarian Empire to instill an anti-Russian sentiment amongst the Ukrainians by supporting Ukrainian independent movements that obviously were in Russia. This was more of like a cloak and dagger attempt to, defeat one of their enemies. Now, the Russian Empire, aware of this growing independent sentiment and anti-Russian sentiment, responded by cracking down even further on Ukrainian culture. So obviously, we've had, after the assassination of Alexander II, and then Alexander the Third cracked down massively on Ukrainian culture, and again during the First World War they did that again, largely in response to the growing idea of Ukrainian separation. However, as the liberal Russian provisional government took to power after the Tsar very peacefully and not at all forcibly stepped away from the throne, they lifted many of the autocratic rules that were imposed by the Tsars that suppressed Ukrainian, but not just Ukrainian, other minority groups. But obviously, I think the main one in this case was the Ukrainian. So they lifted a lot of those oppressive rules and allowed these people to be much more expressive in their views and opinions on Ukrainian society. As a response, the Ukrainian movement acted swiftly in their development of not development, but sort of redevelopment of Ukrainian culture. They reintroduced Ukrainian newspapers. They built cultural institutions, and they even created political parties. Something called the Central Rada was formed in Kyiv, and the aim of this was to be a Ukrainian representative body to represent the ideas of what maybe a potential independent Ukraine could be. A month later, after it was created, this was declared the highest national authority within Ukraine. And the goal was really to achieve independence for Ukraine, and then supposedly eventually transform Russia, after they had successfully done so themselves, transform Russia into a democratic state, which I thought was very interesting. So here you sort of see the strong democratic nature of Cossack culture showing itself in the actions of 20th century Ukrainians, because they were obviously Ukrainians at this point, Ukrainian hopefuls of having an independent nation, and then wanting to turn another nation democratic as well. And to further solidify their claim to independence, the Russian provisional government had actually recognized Ukraine's right of self-autonomy, with a handful of land disputes that still sort of maintained throughout the whole period and throughout the land. However, as history sort of tells us, the Russian Revolution in 1917 hadn't died yet. Viva la Revolution. And the Bolshevik coup, which was really the second part of the revolution, took place in St. Petersburg. The Bolsheviks they'd been brewing ever since the liberal regime took over. The Bolsheviks had sort of been brewing under that regime, slowly building support, planning what they were going to do, and they eventually became the largest Soviet. And by the way, Soviet at this point actually meant council. Well, Soviet means council, so they were the largest council. They were the largest Soviet in the 7 months between the fall of the Tsar and the provisional government, after competing with the other Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. So these Soviets and the provisional government had been in sort of like a dual power struggle, and there was and because they were the two largest ones, they kind of shared that responsibility. And how this worked largely, the Soviets would effectively make demands to the provisional government. So you had all these Soviets on one side who were sort of biting at the heels of the provisional government, and then you actually had the provisional government who were the ruling class, but they were by no means the ruling power, but they were no means secure in their role, and obviously, as we know, they didn't last very long. But how it would work is essentially these Soviets would make their various different demands based on what they sort of represented to the provisional government, and they would be forced to accept some and deny others. And there was a lot of pressure put on them by some of the larger groups, especially the Bolsheviks, to accept theirs, for example. So in the wake of the second phase of the revolution, which is where we see the communists take over, the Bolsheviks take over. The Bolsheviks, what they did, they tried to actually reclaim Ukraine, but obviously the Ukrainians, being fiercely independent people, refused this, and this was refused by the Central Rada, as I said before, had been sort of promoted to the highest voice, highest authority for the Ukrainian people. Now, a chap that we're all familiar with goes by the name of Vladimir Lenin. He played a very integral role in the revolution and had looked upon the Ukrainian independence movement as well as other separatist movements of other minorities, and he saw them as potential allies, only to further his own cause of dethroning the Tsars. However, he fundamentally still believed that Ukraine should remain part of a Russian political and economic union. In modern terms, as people like to say, this is just the same thing in a different font. But ultimately, he wanted to unite every enemy of his enemy under one banner to achieve one goal. And if there are any Game of Thrones fans listening to this, it's kind of like Mance Rayder uniting the wildlings across the wall. Anyway, the Central Rada opposed the Bolshevik Revolution, realizing what the Bolsheviks wanted to do, and not wanting to have that type of governance and be a part of Russia. And they created the Ukrainian People's Republic in response. And they did this to further solidify the establishment of an independent Ukraine. But they did also state that they didn't want complete separation from Russia and would be willing to become part of a union. Now, this is starting to sound familiar. You've got these Soviet councils and Ukraine stating that they would like to be a part of some form of economic and political union with Russia. So now it's starting to sort of take shape. And this is ultimately how, in fact, the Soviet Union did start. The Bolshevists accepting Ukrainian wishes of independence, whilst also coexisting in this union of sorts. But obviously, we're talking about Bolshevists and communists here, and so even though they say they accepted it, they didn't quite. And history shows us that achieving and maintaining communism can only be done through violence, repressiveness, and oftentimes we've seen state-sponsored massacre. That's the only way you can really achieve communism, make sure everyone abides by the communist rule. And as a side note, what I find quite interesting in that, because many people will deny this fact, it is very well known that communism as an ideology has deliberately killed tens of millions more than, for example, the idea of Nazism. Despite people actually denying this fact, it is true. There are, if you think about it, there are still large swathes of people who openly say that they are communists. And that's a fact. In fact, if you walk around some of the cities in the UK, you'll see people with communist flags, etc., etc. And in my opinion, both of these ideas, communism and Nazism, should be regarded as equally deplorable. There are several reasons why that isn't the case. People don't view communism as bad as Nazism, despite having killed deliberately tens of millions more. I think the main reason is ignorance and denial, as I say. Ignorance of the facts of how many people denied, and for those who acknowledge them, openly deny it. But I think it does go. I think it goes beyond that as well. One argument is, as I say, that I've heard personally as well, is that it wasn't their stated intention to kill those people, whereas Nazis said very explicitly they wanted to eradicate a whole race of people. So apparently it makes it better that they didn't mean to kill that many people, but in fact they ended up killing loads more. Whereas the Nazis, they did deliberately and they killed less. Obviously, the intention part, 1, doesn't matter, but 2 is also incorrect because, they did. If as I will go on to explain, you'll hear later on about the a massacre that takes place in Ukraine. You think of what happened in China, Mao Zedong. These are incredibly high numbers of people who have died under communist regimes, and yet people will still say that they are openly and proudly say that they are communists. And in my opinion, that is completely ridiculous. It is as bad as someone saying that they are a Nazi, in my personal opinion. Anyway, that is definitely a topic for another time. Otherwise, I really will be here for days, maybe. So, back to what I was saying before. So, what Lenin did is he presented them with an ultimatum. And it was very simple. Join our union or we'll kill all of you. And he did say that he accepted their right to self-determination. But the conditions of this autonomy would essentially be under his rules. Which obviously lacks the very crucial self in self-determination. But anyway, being a proud people, the Ukrainians didn't throw themselves at the feet of the Bolshevists and opted for war. Now remember, World War I was still ongoing at this point. So there was fisticuffs aplenty in Europe, let's say. And the warring nations were constantly trying to find new ways to defeat their enemy. So the Ukrainians entered negotiations with some of the other nations, including the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Having already been invaded by the Bolshevists, an Austrian-German offensive into Ukraine had kicked the revolutionaries out of Kyiv and later in Ukraine itself. So, there's a real politic going on. Cloak and dagger, supporting uprisings from within the empire. So the socialist policies of the Ukrainian government, particularly land nationalisation, when the Austrian Germans sort of came into Ukraine, the honeymoon period didn't last very long, and the natural socialists that the Ukrainians were clashed with German interests in maximising the food production for their war effort. Because obviously, as I've said before, the arable Ukrainian land would have been a major boost for the struggling Germany. At this point, they were really struggling to sort of fend off the French and the British, as well as obviously the Russians. This led to a German-supported coup in 1918, and they overthrew the Rada government and installed a new regime that effectively favoured landowners and the Russian urban middle class. So this new government, they did face strong opposition from the Ukrainian nationalists, the socialists, and the peasants, all sort of united again, realising that their new overlords weren't very good. And with Germany's capitulation in World War I in November, the preparations began to overthrow the installed regime, which lasted after Germany surrendered a mere month, and they abdicated in December. Meanwhile, that was going on in western Ukraine. A new state was declared in October 1918, leading to a conflict with Poland over the area of Galicia. Now, for those who are familiar with their geography, there is also another place in Spain called Galicia, and this is not that area. The Polish were never in Galicia, neither were the Ukrainians. This is another area also called Galicia. And although the Poles captured Lviv in November, which obviously was in Galicia, most of Galicia remained under Ukrainian control until late July 1919. So there were efforts to unify the two Ukrainian states, but between the west and the east, but this was hindered by the ongoing conflict that I was just mentioning before. So in Kyiv, this new government that was set up struggled to establish effective administration amid, sort of increasing chaos that was happening in the area, and also external hostility from the Polish, from the Russians, from the Germans, etc. There was peasants' unrest, demoralization of the army, and sort of partisan movements all further weakened the government's authority. There were also a surge of pogroms against the Jewish population, which occurred in 1919, and this was committed by various forces and also civilians. Now, I touched on this in a different episode about, when things went wrong, everyone just immediately looked at the Jewish people and then decided, sort of collectively, let's just get them, because they're the ones who we've always targeted, so let's just do it again. And I think I did make a reference to pogroms in Ukraine that encouraged people to move to modern day Israel, and this was one such of those. So the Ukrainians did what seemed to be the de facto course of action when any civil unrest took place, and they started killing Jews. A common theme, really, throughout Europe, unfortunately. Meanwhile, back over in eastern Ukraine, the Bolsheviks were being relentless in their pursuit, and by late 1918 had regained control of Kyiv. Another force, they were called the White Army, had also campaigned against the Bolsheviks, and in this conflict caused widespread destruction of Ukrainian national life. Now, despite this White Army being expelled from Ukraine, through defeats by February 1920, the government had actually sought Polish military aid. Obviously, the Poles who they were had their own issues with not too long ago, and this led to a treaty in April of the same year. And in exchange for Polish support, the Ukraine were required to relinquish claims that they had to certain territories near the Ukrainian and Polish border. Now, in this joint campaign, the Poles and the Ukrainians were able to recapture Kyiv from the Bolsheviks in May 1920, but a subsequent Soviet counteroffensive pushed the forces back out of Kyiv. The Poland and the Soviets then, realizing that this endless sort of fighting, and remember at this point, the war had finished in 1918. No one really had appetite for war, yet people are still fighting over these lands. So the Poles and the Soviets reached an agreement in March 1921, which is 3 years after the First World War, to still be fighting. That's hard going. And Poland recognized Soviet Ukraine and retained the annexed western Ukrainian lands. Now, it is just worth noting that, at the time, not everyone in Ukraine wanted an independent Ukraine. And there were many Jews, Russians, and Poles who were not supporting the idea of an independent movement. And, I talk about Lenin's involvement here in this because he was the driver behind this movement, really. He was one of the main sort of actors in it. When Lenin was first sort of, rising, the Ukrainian Rada had actually first supported him and his revolution. But, as I alluded to before, as soon as he achieved his revolutionary goals, he revealed his true intentions for Ukraine, which was basically to absorb them into a new state. And as I mentioned, once the Poles and the Soviets they came to an agreement without Ukraine, and they were like, right, you're ours now. So in 1922, Russia and Ukraine were signatories of the founding of the Union of Soviet Republics. Sorry, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is USSR. And this also included Belarus. So from 1922, when they were the first signatories along with Russia, they became an invaluable part of the USSR. They were the second most important country in the USSR for Russia. And with the USSR established and Ukraine fully under their control, the priorities of this new union progressed to stability economically and politically. Lenin introduced something called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP, in 1921 as a temporary retreat from full state control over the economy. Now, he did this in large part due to a famine and the subsequent, popular civil unrest that was caused, in large effect, by war communism, which obviously during the war and the First World War and the small sort of wars afterwards with the Poles and the Ukrainians focused on resources not to feed the population but to win the war, which meant that other things there wasn't much emphasis on feeding, for example, the population. So this is where the famines came in, and realizing that you're no longer in war means you no longer need to treat your industries the way you were. So that switch away from war communism to just normal communism. However, I believe once you make a pizza, no matter what shape you cut it in, it's still a pizza, and war communism is going to get you the same results. But the NEP, the NEP, it was important because of some of the changes that he introduced. So the main components of the NEP were, number one, agricultural reforms. Peasants were allowed to sell their surplus produce on the open market after fulfilling a fixed quota for the state. And this helped promote agricultural production and also reduce famine. There were small-scale private enterprise. So small businesses known as NEP men were permitted to operate in retail, light industry and agriculture. And this stimulated economic growth and consumer goods production. There was state control of heavy industry. So while allowing some private enterprises in agriculture and small-scale industry, the state maintained control over major industries, banking and foreign trade. And as I said, it was the NEP was quite important, and it did achieve several of the objectives. So they needed to recover the economy. And what the NEP did was that it stabilized the Soviet economy and it revived the agricultural production and light industry. And it also, as I said, alleviated the widespread famine and economic crisis that was going on. It also helped with the political stability by easing the harsh policies of war communism and allowing some degree of private enterprise. So the NEP reduced social unrest and opposition to the Bolshevik regime. And also, it sort of led that transition to socialism. Lenin viewed the NEP as a transitional phase towards socialism, providing the necessary economic foundation for future socialist development. And the NEP also led to the growth of a new class of wealthy peasants and entrepreneurs. That's that's about as good as it gets with communism. A wealthy peasant. And these were known as NEP men. These the small businesses that were able to operate in retail, as I mentioned before. But what's most interesting about these policies, is that even with a small amount of capitalism and free market enterprise and policies, they were able to solve, in part, some of the economic disasters that communism causes. I mean, by the way, these were limited capitalist policies and free market policies, but even then, it helped alleviate some of the crisis. And yeah, you could say, well, it was war communism versus regular, but these issues were going to persist, whether it was war communism or peacetime communism. It's all the same thing. Anyway, by 1924, Lenin had grown very unwell. He'd suffered 3 strokes, and that was eventually his demise, and he passed away sometime in 1924. I can't exactly remember the month. And he was obviously replaced by probably the most infamous man. I would say he is probably the most infamous man to come out of Russia. That is obviously Joseph Stalin. But just a word on Lenin quickly. Actually, quite an interesting person, and I didn't know about him. He was actually quite. He was very interested, he was very into his fitness, and he swam a lot, and he ran a lot as well. And on top of that, he actually lived somewhat of a Spartan lifestyle, supposedly similar to sort of like the teachings of Marcus Aurelius. He didn't really have many possessions as such. And he didn't particularly, enjoy the company of those who were, self-important, let's say. And yeah, he lived despite his position, his obviously very high position in Russian society, he lived a very modest lifestyle, which I thought was quite interesting. So by 1929, Stalin, the big man, he'd been in power for a few years, and he had decided to implement some of his own economic policies, and effectively phasing out the somewhat liberal policies of Lenin's NEP, the NEP. And the policies that Stalin introduced were effectively, collectivization. And so, he'd learned nothing from the mistakes, but also the slight improvements that were seen by some of Lenin's policies. Anyway, this policy of collectivization forced farmers to give up their privately held land and join what's known as collective farms. They also imposed unrealistically high grain quotas on these peasant farmers, which they then used to sell abroad. Ironically enough, they would sell, on the international market to fund their own, industrialization and other vanity projects of Stalin's. Obviously, not that industrialization is a vanity project. It's probably very smart at the time, but a lot of the communist projects were very much so vanity projects. And these policies, these collectivization policies and etc., they were especially harsh on the aforementioned NEP men. who were, they were effectively they were lucky enough to, well, not lucky enough. They worked hard enough to amass enough sort of food and wealth to not be hungry, to you know float slightly above that line of misery that everyone sort of suffers under communism. And as well as these netmen, the policy also wasn't really well received in Ukraine, who had opposed this policy. I mean, obviously, Ukraine being so arable, producing such high yield of crops, why should they have to suffer by these inefficient policies by inefficient bureaucrats when they have all this farmland that they've farmed for many years now, and they know exactly how to farm it, yet they're hardly getting any food from it. So obviously, they oppose these. They oppose these very harsh policies. In response to that, Stalin committed to food seizures of the Ukrainian peasantry, and he would take away whatever grain they had remaining, as well as all the animals on their farms. Basically, as a consequence for them resisting, practically anything that remained on their farms was taken away. So not just crops, but animals, not just animals, but even farming equipment. And as you can imagine, if this is what everyone relies on to survive, to eat, to make money, you strip that away, they'll have nothing left. And unsurprisingly, this led to the death of roughly, and these are the figures here, 4 million Ukrainians. So 4 million Ukrainians died from this these food seizure, this effectively it's land seizure, as well. And of course, if you dared to resist this policy of food confiscation, you were shot summarily. And this very shocking event in Ukrainian history became known as the Holodomor. And this is either the first or the second worst thing to happen in Ukraine in the 20th century. I would argue it's the first for Ukraine, however, on an international stage. The second, obviously, being the nuclear disaster might be the worst. I'm pretty sure the Holodomor takes the top trump on that. But on this topic, an author called Anne Applebaum, I believe I'm pronouncing her name correctly, wrote a book called Red Famine. And on the topic of the Holodomor, she writes that, and I quote, "Neither crop failure nor bad weather caused the famine in Ukraine. Although the chaos of collectivization helped create the conditions that led to famine, the high numbers of deaths in Ukraine between 1932 and 1934, and especially the spike in the spring of 1933, were not caused directly by collectivization either. Starvation was the result, rather, of the forcible removal of food from people's homes, the roadblocks that prevented peasants from seeking work or food, the harsh rules of the blacklists imposed on farms and villages, the restrictions on barter and trade, and the vicious propaganda campaign designed to persuade Ukrainians to watch, unmoved, as their neighbours died of hunger." So, as I was saying before, you had collectivization first, which was, by all accounts, it is a terrible policy because it'll never work. It'll mean that people are barely surviving. Then, as a consequence of people resisting collectivization, you had what I just described. Very vindictive, and 4 million people are dead. Now, that's enough. 4 million people dead by effectively one man is enough to, warrant whatever ideology he believes in to be a terrible ideology. And, that's those numbers, 4 million. I mean, they get a lot worse than that. Not just by him, but by other people who are also communists. So it's a funny one. Something I still haven't figured out why, it's so popular in our society. So, fast forward to the second major war in the 20th century, the Second World War. And as you can imagine, being so close to Russia and fairly close to Germany, and just given their hard luck that they've experienced so far, the Second World War was no walk in the park for the Ukrainians. For context, though, up until now, under Soviet control, Ukraine didn't look like what it does as of now. As Poland had taken part of Western Ukraine and incorporated it into their land, as well as Romania. But obviously, as we know, the war began when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. And as many know, the Germans and the Soviets initially started the war as fairly loose allies, maybe frenemies, as they say. Having an understanding of what they want, but not really trusting each other, and obviously that trust would boil over to leading them to become enemies. Stalin and Hitler had made a preemptive agreement to split Poland between them. And this agreement was known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And in this, the Ukrainian lands that Poland had annexed did come under the control of the Soviets and were incorporated into the Ukrainian SSR. But more broadly came under the control of the USSR. And that's sort of where we see the modern shape of Ukraine today. Now, in their reoccupation of Ukraine, the Soviets carried out mass arrests, deportations, and executions of any political activists and Ukrainian nationalists. And this was primarily done through the group called the NKVD, and they were the secret, the Soviet secret police. The Soviets also continued their forced collectivization of agricultural produce, as well as other repressive policies, as you can imagine. Now, as I said, the loose alliance between the USSR and Nazi Germany didn't last, and Germany, some say foolishly, others say the conflict was inevitable, and if Hitler didn't, Stalin would have. But Germany invaded the USSR in 1941. Operation Barbarossa, as it's known. But the important part for the Ukrainian story here is that the Nazis had initially tricked the Ukrainian people into supporting them with the promise of independence if they collaborated with the Nazis and helped them fight against the Red Army. Now, this collaboration between the Ukrainians and the Nazis will later be, and I'll explore this in the second episode, is sort of like the start of an argument that Putin uses in his defense for invading Ukraine, as they say, and some people do say, and accurately so, that there are Nazi groups in Ukraine that start from their collaboration with the Nazi party. Obviously, neo-Nazis now in Ukraine. Now, initially there was some in the Ukrainian population who greeted the Nazis, viewing them as liberators and potential allies for their movement of Ukrainian independence. The enemy of my enemy, etc., etc. And some of those groups included the Organization of Ukrainian Nationals and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. However, they very quickly discovered that they were in fact not on their side at all. And once the Germans had, initially thrusted themselves into that area, Ukraine and Russia, they took control of the land. And with that, the Nazis also brought with them their racial policies of extermination of the Jews. Other Ukrainians were taken as slave labourers from Ukraine into the German concentration camps and working camps. And, supposedly they say around 2.2 million were taken out of Ukraine. Now, Ukraine was strategically important to Germany, as again, they were the breadbasket of Europe. Now, this is a common theme throughout Ukrainian history, and they're one one dependable natural resource, or not the only dependable natural resource, because they have quite a few, but one of the main dependable features of their land, being their how arable it is, also is the cause of so much of their destruction, because everyone seeks to take advantage of this. They were seen as a breadbasket of Europe. However, Ukraine was also rich in other minerals. They were rich in coal, iron ore, and manganese. And these are all important for the Nazis, or any nation really, to maintain their war effort. Now, the Nazis, recognizing the absolute behemoth of an army they were facing in the Red Army, decided to conscript Ukrainians into the army to help them fight the Soviets. Otherwise, they knew that they were going to struggle despite their superior training in weapons and artillery, etc. Now, beyond the natural resources that Ukraine could provide, strategically, the location of Ukraine was also important. So obviously you had access to the Ukrainian natural resources, but given that Ukraine is both flat and a border to Russia, it means that the Nazis could use Ukraine as a launching pad into Russia, so they don't have to maintain these long supply lines. And two, there were a lot of natural resources that were key to Russia near-ish, in that sort of geographic region. And if the Nazis could take that from the Russians, it would be, one, beneficial for them, but two, it would absolutely cripple the Russian army. So, they made a play in terms of where they thought would be a strategic place to take and to launch their attacks into Russia. And they were right. It was very important. It was an important place, a gateway into Russia. And that's why largely Russia is so keen on Ukraine to not be part of NATO now, because they recognize that given how close it is to Russia and how close it is to a lot of their strategic natural resources, etc., they can't afford for that to ever be taken over again. I mean, you think about when Napoleon invaded Russia, granted it wasn't from Ukraine, it was from up north, from the Baltic sort of countries. It still reflects the need for Russia, at least, to not have their enemies able to launch from places close by, as I think it was Lithuania that Napoleon sort of launched the invasion from, and then Ukraine, the Nazis were able to launch from Ukraine. To the surprise of nobody, the Nazi occupation of Ukraine was very difficult for the Ukrainian people. However, the Nazi invasion of the USSR was ultimately unsuccessful, and the Soviets were able to take back control of Ukraine, which was also equally just as torrid. So in World War II, around 1.4 million Jews were killed by Nazis in Ukraine alone. Many more fled into Russia. The estimated figure is between 5 and 7 million Ukrainian lives were lost during World War II. And then there was another famine in 1946 to 1947 that claimed 1 million more lives in Ukraine. So, suffice to say, Ukraine had a bloody rough go of it in the first half of the 20th century. I won't really touch too much on post-World War II Soviet Ukraine because, even though there are key events that took place, it's not really that important for this podcast. So, this episode. So what I'll do is I'm going to actually fast forward now to a couple decades. And in 1954, this was an important year. An important event happened in the history of Ukraine, especially in relation to their relationship with Russia, as the USSR had transferred control over the control of Crimea over to Ukraine. Now, Crimea had been part of Russia since 1783, which was when Catherine the Great annexed it, as I mentioned before. However, as I also stated, it had changed hands a lot between different empires and kingdoms up until that point. So by 1954, Crimea, which had a population of about 1.1 million people, was 75% Russian and 25% Ukrainian. Now, it did used to be populated with Crimean Tatars, but they were forcibly deported by Stalin in 1944. And they were basically sent to live in the backwaters of, the USSR and Central Asia. Now, to some, and indeed to me, it seemed like an odd, very uncharacteristic move from the Soviets to willingly hand over land to a different country, even if they were part of the same union. And at that, it actually being entirely their idea. Now, why this happened, supposedly, was because Nikita Khrushchev, who was he was consolidating his power as the first secretary of the Communist Party of the entire Soviet Union, and he saw the transfer as a way to solidify Soviet control over Ukraine. It was intended to demonstrate Russian-Ukrainian unity and secure support from Ukrainian elites, particularly in Khrushchev's power struggle against his, political opponent, the Soviet Prime Minister Georgy Malenkov. And he was initially seen as the successor to Stalin, so Khrushchev sort of had an uphill battle. But in addition to that, Khrushchev had actually had a history with Ukraine, having served as the head of the Communist Party in Ukraine, and therefore viewed the transfer as a means to fortify the region's loyalty to the Soviet regime. The move was also seen as a strategic effort to stabilize Ukraine after recent civil conflicts took place in Galicia, Volhynia, and some other parts of western Ukraine, where there were many unforgivable atrocities that took place on both sides in these civil wars. Now, to achieve further control, Khrushchev, who was at this point the leader of the USSR, oversaw the movement of approximately 860,000 Russians into Ukraine. And by the way, this was also done in other parts of USSR, notably in the Baltic countries of Latvia and Estonia, which both had much smaller ethnic Russian population by the end of the Second World War. And supposedly as well, just on that, on the decision to hand over, to cede Crimea to Ukraine, it's said that Khrushchev had, during his time as leader of the Communist Party in Ukraine, Khrushchev had developed quite a soft spot for the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian lands. And that actually even came from his granddaughter. So supposedly there was also, it was also an emotional decision as opposed to it purely being, this power play. Now, some say it was also for economic reasons, as Crimea was one of the most hit during the Second World War in terms of the destruction, and the USSR didn't want direct control over rebuilding their land. They didn't want to have that financial burden. It's sort of worth noting that there are a few other potential reasons why this was done, but many of these can be disputed, and even some of those that I just provided can be disputed as well. The economic reason really. All the money came from it was a centralized government, so all the money came from them anyway. So they would be paying for it whether it was with them or with Ukraine. So is that a valid reason? It's debated anyway. Ultimately, I don't actually think there is concrete evidence for the justification for this event. So, it's one of those, we'll never really know, but it happened. But that sort of handing over land is very important in terms of understanding the claims that Russia supposedly have to Ukraine now. So, skip a few more decades and we land in the year 1986. For some, you might automatically know what happened in 1986 in Ukraine. And this was obviously the famous nuclear disaster in Chernobyl. This event was very significant on the world stage because what it revealed about the state of the Soviet Union, and more importantly, the natural failings of communism. Now, the USSR at this point was still involved in the Cold War, and they were trying to compete with the USA in an arms race. It's well known that in many cases, Soviet technology was in fact behind that of America's. Now, was this due to a shortage of genius minds in the USSR? Absolutely not, no. The USSR possessed some of the greatest scientific minds of their time, without a doubt. It was due to their political philosophy of centralization. A handful of people cannot possibly administer every aspect of society. And on top of that, try and compete on a research front with the most powerful and advanced nation on Earth. But, their nuclear technology, like a lot of their other technology, was inferior. Their power stations had design flaws. People were not willing to own up to their own mistakes or point out any flaws in fear of being shot. So you can understand why the system may not work. Now, this disaster sped up the decline of the USSR as nations became very aware of their many failings, of the USSR's many failings, despite their efforts to cover up the disaster. And in fact, this cover-up was also sort of encouraged the further dismantling of the USSR and, for example, Ukrainian independence as well. People started to mistrust the authorities in the USSR after the disaster due to that failed attempt to cover it up and also their delayed evacuation. I would say a silver lining of this disaster was the acceleration of Mikhail Gorbachev's policies, which basically prioritized reform and transparency within the USSR, and also increased cooperation with the global authorities. Now, I say this is a silver lining. This is a very, very thin silver lining on a very, very dark, on a very large, dark cloud. An interesting fact that some of you may not know, most of you probably will not know this, the explosion from the power plant was so large that it had actually affected the North Welsh farming industry, with 344 farmers in Wales were put under, observation restrictions after their livestock were recording high levels of radiation, even as late as 2011. I read that in a BBC article. Very interesting, but it just goes to show how deadly that was. And obviously, Chernobyl now is still, even though I do believe you can actually visit Chernobyl now. God knows why you would do that, but people do. You obviously have to take a lot of precaution there. I guess it would be quite interesting to sort of visit and see, but I'm not so sure I would do that, because you have those devices that measure radiation, and I think they just go nuts when you sort of take them into Chernobyl. Another interesting fact, actually, is that apparently in Chernobyl now, some of the animals that move back in, obviously exposed to radiation, they actually have noticed that they've developed some immunity to certain types of cancer, some of the wolves that are living there, which I thought was very interesting. Don't know how you would convince people to expose themselves to radiation well, actually, I guess they do that already, so I guess that kind of makes sense. Anyway, I digress. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and Ukraine was one of the signatories that disbanded the USSR, which meant that officially Ukraine was recognized as a state. Now, it's very ironic that Ukraine were one of the signatories that, joined or was formulated the USSR, and they were also one of the signatories that disbanded it. So a referendum took place not too long after regarding the independence of a Ukrainian state. Out of the 31.8 million voters, 92.3% said they wanted an independent Ukraine, and 7.7% said they did not want an independent Ukraine, and that had a 84.18% voter turnout. So a unanimous or a very decisive yes on that front. Now, obviously, the collapse wasn't as smooth as that. It wasn't purely just, we're done one day with this, next day with something else. No, it was a lot more complicated. And there were attempts made by some very, very hardline Soviets to keep the USSR around, but they ultimately failed. Within that year, all the previous states within the USSR declared independence, and weirdly enough, no idea why, Kazakhstan was the last member of the Soviet Union, and it wasn't just a case of days. They held out for a few more months. I would love to know why. I don't. Maybe one to research. Now, counter to what is commonly known, by the time of Gorbachev, the Americans had actually wanted the USSR to survive, and they were becoming something of a partner with the Americans. One of the main reasons why is because they saw the USSR as sort of keeping everything in control. If you break up the USSR, you've got all these nuclear weapons that they spread around Europe in the hands of people that they really weren't too sure what was going to happen. If you think about what happened in Europe after the collapse of the USSR, things were not that things weren't peaceful necessarily. So, the Americans were quite keen, given that the USSR were now being a lot more cooperative. They were quite keen to keep it around, but that failed. Now, the Ukraine actually played. Obviously, they were the signatories, but they actually played an important role in the dismemberment of the USSR before they signed. Because once it became clear that Ukraine no longer wanted to be part of the empire, of this Soviet empire, the Russians also had no desire to continue, and that was mainly because, if you take away Ukraine from that, Russia would actually be in a religious minority, in that the Union would now be a Muslim majority. And that is something that the Russians didn't want. But the collapse of the Soviet Union didn't bring an end to the communist saga in Eastern Europe. And even today, it still impacts politics in that region of the European continent, especially between the Balkan states, who, not much later, as I mentioned before, went to war with each other, and that also became particularly violent and vindictive. And even now, the relationships between these states and cultures are tentative at best. But, we all know what it's like out there. But switching back to Ukraine, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine became the third, and this goes back to why the Americans didn't want the USSR to collapse. Ukraine became the third largest holder of nuclear weapons, which starts to pose some issues. And although it possessed the warheads and the capacity to make more, the software that controlled them was in Russia. So, not ideal. And so Russia and the Western states agreed to recognize and respect Ukraine's independence, their sovereign status, in return for them handing over most of its nuclear capacity back to Russia. And then in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum it was basically about security assurances. It basically provided, or it meant that the Ukrainian state would have to destroy the remaining warheads. Now, as I mentioned before, the location of Ukraine was and is very important for Russia because they are the direct neighbor of Russia. And to the west lies Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary, all of whom had communist pasts. But by the 21st century, they had all pivoted towards, the US foreign policy, US hegemony, and other Western alliances, NATO and the EU, etc. However, Russia came to see these countries as a buffer to American, to NATO, to EU encroachment. So with the other countries slowly moving over, Ukraine had to toe the line between Russia and the West, especially since there were still a lot of Russian people living in eastern Ukraine. So Leonid Kravchuk, I think I've pronounced that correctly, was elected the first president of Ukraine, and he served as president of Ukraine until 1994. Now, his role was largely, seen as Ukraine's transitory president. He primarily oversaw a lot of the initial transition from a communist USSR member state to a more cooperative European/Western independent country. However, it wasn't all that simple in terms of, how the ease at which he did this. And it is fair to say that although Ukraine was successful in becoming more westernized, it was, or more importantly, he was unsuccessful in the more finer details of governing a country. Ukrainian economy tanked, corruption became rampant as the privatization of the Soviet industries took place, mirroring somewhat the events that took place in Russia that led to effectively the Russian oligarchy that we have today. In fact, corruption in Ukraine became quite the problem, and they were under the spotlight of international agencies until the very recent war started. But I will talk about that later in the second part of this episode. So, the 2004 presidential elections in Ukraine nearly led to a civil war. President Leonid Kuchma, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly as well, who had been cleared to seek a third term, instead had vowed to support Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych with strong backing from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. His opposition candidate was one Viktor Yushchenko, and it's quite confusing just trying to sometimes remember the two different names because they're both Victor, and then they both surnames with begin with Y. So Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko, and he was running basically on an anti-corruption platform. That was his, unique selling point, if you like, as a politician. And he faced significant obstacles, including being barred from campaigning in Yanukovych's strongholds, and, on a personal level, suffered dioxin poisoning, which actually disfigured part of his face. And this is reportedly to have been carried out by the Ukrainian security forces. Certainly wasn't an accident. In the first round of voting on the 31st of October, Yushchenko and Yanukovych each received roughly 40% of the vote. And then in the subsequent runoff, Yanukovych was declared the winner. However, there were allegations of fraud that led to mass protests, which became known as the Orange Revolution. So the protesters, who were wearing Yushchenko's campaign colour orange, staged roughly a fortnight of demonstrations. Yanukovych's supporters in the east had threatened succession if the results were annulled. So in December, the Supreme Court invalidated the election and ordered a new runoff in December of the same month, just later in the month. And then in that new runoff, Yushchenko won the new vote with around 52% of the vote. And despite Yanukovych's challenges to these results, Yushchenko was inaugurated in January 2005. Now, Yushchenko's presidency was not much better, and was also wrought with many issues, and had a number of reshuffles and re-elections. Eventually, after it was clear to many that it wasn't working, he was forced to accept Yanukovych as president again. He was accepted to force Yanukovych. So he was very unpopular. Yanukovych, he lost, but then was somehow appointed again in 2010. After he narrowly beat another candidate, Yulia Tymoshenko. Now, interestingly, again, Yanukovych was popular in the east, which is the more Russian side, whilst Tymoshenko was more popular in the west, I guess you could say the more non-Russian side, or the more European or Western side. Given his closer affiliations to Russia, Ukraine's relationship with Putin under Yanukovych had improved a lot, and so much so that they extended Russia's lease on the naval port in Sevastopol, which was due to expire in 2017, and they extended it until 2042. And in exchange, they received cheaper Russian gas, which Europe at this point was very addicted to. In addition, Ukraine also officially abandoned its goal of joining NATO eventually, which obviously pleased the Russians and very much so displeased the West. Now, in 2014, we have another major event in recent Ukrainian history. That is the Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity, which started due to Viktor Yanukovych. When he was re-elected, he U-turned on his intention, but broadly Ukraine's intention, to sign a document that would create a political association and free trade agreement with the EU. Now, this sort of works in unison with the fact that he was pivoting away from NATO, also pivoting away from the EU. Now, his U-turn on this led to an early presidential election, and Yanukovych lost, and he lost his position as president. Now, Russia decided at this point to get involved, and this is when Russia invaded part of Ukraine in 2014. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, they invaded Crimea. And the Russians publicly stated that they believed the Euromaidan revolution was in fact an armed coup. A claim I think, and many do think it as well, that it has, legs, so to speak. In the run-up to signing these treaties between Ukraine and the EU, Putin had made his displeasure very much clear by placing embargoes on certain Ukrainian goods and also increasing Russia's gas prices to Ukraine. Yanukovych, I'm not too sure where this sort of change happened, why it happened. Probably external pressure from, Western nations. He was initially quite determined to sign these treaties with Russia, as he believed Russia was not treating them as an equal nation. However, the EU terms were not favourable either in terms of the monetary support that they were able to give. So they were trying to dissuade him, bring him back to the EU. It's reported that that Ukraine needed at least 160 billion euros over the 3-year period in able to survive the harm that the Russian bans and embargoes on the Ukrainian economy, and also the losses that would be inflicted on Ukraine due to the requests made by the EU regarding the reforms that Ukraine would need to implement. So changes that they needed to their society would result in many losses, financially, politically, etc. Later on, Yanukovych, with Putin, obviously in secret, met with Putin, and the subject of the meeting is unknown, but we can infer from that, based on the fact that a few days later, Yanukovych announced the U-turn on the agreement with the EU. So Putin definitely, leaned on him. Now, during these protests, which obviously flared up all across the country, 18 policemen and something like 130 protesters died, maybe more. I can't remember the numbers. I don't know the numbers specifically. The protest itself, however, it did start off fairly small. It started off as one of these peaceful protests. We're against the bill, but the Ukrainian authorities were very heavy-handed in their reactions to the protests, unnecessarily so, and very quickly the severity of the protests grew. It swelled. Now, some say the protests would have remained small if the authorities hadn't responded in that way, but I personally don't see that being the case. I think that argument aims to put the blame solely on the authorities / Ukraine, almost like well, we didn't want to do this, but you forced our hand. That sort of claim. I think the protest would have happened anyway. There was a lot of displeasure. I imagine there was a lot of influence by the West to avoid that happening. So I'm not so sure if that's a valid excuse. Anyway, it did grow, and the outcome was that Yanukovych was forcibly removed as president. Now, there are some who speculate that the West was involved in this attempt to overthrow the incumbent government. And obviously there are others who dismiss this. And when I say some who speculate that the West were involved, obviously that includes Russia. But many people in the West also do believe this, and not, people would have you believe that there's either a group of people who are, on the payroll of the Russians, and then there are a group of people who are completely honest and, very straight, etc. And that's a very silly way of looking at this, because people look at these things objectively, and that just because they defend something that might sort of benefit Russia's appearance on the global stage doesn't mean by any means that they're on the Russian payroll. I doubt there are these groups of highly intelligent academics and geopolitical analysts who are all sponsored by Russia. I'm sure there are some. I'm not denying that, but given the vast number of people who believe this, I doubt it's that. It's almost like a school of thought. I could be wrong in that assessment, but I don't think so. Nonetheless, there are people on either side of the argument that speculate that the West was involved to overthrow the government, and the likely conclusion is we will never know if they were or if they were not. So who's to say that which side is accurate? I would naturally, knowing the West's record, I would say that they probably were involved to some degree. And I think it's very naive for people to assume that it would only be the Russian state or the Chinese state who engage in these kind of activities. Not even naive, it's actually complete ignorance, because there are many examples that we know of that they do it. But what I will say on that topic, and any other similar examples of those who oppose that, when people do try and dispute the claims of foreign involvement in a coup or a protest, and their defense is, well, where's the evidence? I mean, what a ridiculous thing to say. Where's the evidence of a secret coup? I mean, why the hell would there be evidence available to the public? Oh yeah, let me just pop into the British Library. Here's a paper trail that the CIA published regarding their attempted coup in Honduras. No, I mean, I think sometimes people will just try and use these ridiculous sort of arguments. Well, if there's no evidence, then it can't be true. I need to see it to believe it. Well, let me tell you, if you think that you need evidence to prove the CIA's wrongdoings in South America or wherever else, or Russia's wrongdoings here, there, or anywhere, and you're only relying on evidence to prove that, then, I've got bad news for you. But yes, so we'll never know. That's the honest that's the honest answer. We will never know, unless maybe, I know the CIA do that thing where they publish like secrets after, I don't know how many years. Is it 100 years or 50 years? I don't know. It wouldn't be 50 years, more than 50 years. But even then, I suspect that a lot of the stuff is discarded, thrown away, blanked out with black tape or something. I don't know. So that same year, there was a pro-Russian uprising in eastern Ukraine. And obviously in eastern Ukraine, that is where those who are typically more pro-Russian. And Russia is accused of sponsoring this. And this goes back to exactly what I was saying before. Now, imagine on that same argument, someone said, well, where's the evidence? I mean, why the hell would there be evidence for that? Maybe there is, I'm not too sure, but it's not going to be readily available. You know, Russia on RT News. Oh, yeah, we sponsored that one. No. So Russia is accused of sponsoring the incursion, and yeah, they most definitely did, and I can say that without requiring evidence. Fighting took place in the Donbass region. There were armed men in unmarked uniforms that surrounded the key areas of the peninsula, such as the airports, airports, ports, major roads. There is no doubt that these people were Russian soldiers, or at the very least, they were a Russian-backed militia. They were very militarily strategic in their choices of where to capture. So, there's no doubt Russian involvement. A chap called Sergei Askionov, hopefully I've got that right, Askionov. He was installed as Crimea's prime minister. Shortly after that, this new infant Crimean parliament voted to break away from Ukraine and join the Russian Federation. So things are starting to look a bit like the history books of Ukraine and Crimea of the past. So, in an attempt to further stamp down his authority on Ukraine, Putin terminated the contract that gave Ukraine the cheaper gas, and in return for a lease on the naval port of Sevastopol. And the reason he did this is because, well, he now has control of the port, so I don't need his lease, therefore I'm not giving you cheaper gas. And, it thusly increased the price of gas to Ukraine. In addition to the annexation of Crimea, there were two other separatist regions that emerged, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, both of whom declared themselves independent of Ukraine. So we fast forward now to 2019. Former actor Volodymyr Zelensky has become Ukraine's president. That same year, an important change in the constitution of Ukraine took place, which drew Ukraine closer to EU and NATO, escalated tensions, which was effectively the nail in the coffin for Russia regarding NATO encroachment. I mean, I don't know what they really expected to happen after they invaded Crimea. Maybe they thought that, they'd done enough and Ukraine were like, okay, we're done. Maybe Russia called Ukraine's bluff and said you weren't going to do it, and they did it. But they did it. And that was the result. What we see now is the result of that. So in 2021, there was a law had changed in Ukraine that allowed for the sale of farmland in Ukraine, which was the first time in 20 years. And the sort of ban on that was originally put in place to prevent an oligarchy similar to the Russian experience following the fall of the Soviet Union. As I said before, we sort of mentioned this before, which sort of led to the oligarchies that we see today. Now, this sale in Ukrainian land is of somewhat significant importance. And I will explore this in part 2 as well, because it allowed people to purchase Ukrainian land that wasn't just available to Ukrainians. It was available to the international community of investors. And if you sort of consider in this environment today the type of financial organizations, individuals that buy up a lot of land, especially land that's valuable, farmland, big institutions. But as I said, I will get to that in the second episode. So the Baltic Sea has always been an area of significant importance to Russia. By the time the Great Northern War was taking place, Sweden had taken, complete control of the Baltic Sea. And that was the only, potential region where Russia could build an economically crucial warm water seaport into Europe. So very important for Russia. Now, with Sweden's membership into NATO, the Baltic Sea has, and by the way, Sweden had very recently, fairly recently become a member of NATO. The Baltic Sea has sort of colloquially become known as NATO's lake. However, it's not necessarily true, as Kaliningrad, which is a Russian enclave on the Baltic coast, on the Baltic coast, is the HQ of Russia's Baltic fleet. Now, if nobody knows where Kaliningrad is, it really is this small snippet of land on the Baltic coast, not attached by land to Russia whatsoever. It actually looks a bit peculiar when you see it there. But that is sort of so Russia still do have a stake in the Baltic Sea, and it does still remain an important port for Russia. However, obviously, it's Crimea and the Crimean port, which is probably, if not the most, maybe the second most. I'm not too sure. I'm not a geopolitical strategist. I don't know which one is more important for them. But I would say Crimea probably has more importance to Russia. But by no means does that mean the Baltic Sea is not of importance. But you can, knowing the importance of these two areas, especially Crimea, seeing the importance of that for Russia, you can start to see why it was so strategically important for them, and why they did in fact take Crimea as theirs in 2014, and why they probably, even as this war goes on, they will probably not lose Crimea. If the war does come to a negotiation, which I hope it does, so that it can end and these people's lives can stop, young people's lives can stop being brutally ended. Even at the negotiation table, Russia will not let that go. You can be sure as hell that will remain in Russia's control. So I think it's a good place to stop here, mainly on the account that this is coming on to 3 hours, and that is way longer than I thought it was going to be, even though I knew it was going to be long. So I think it's a good place to stop at the war itself. Obviously, I can't talk about. Well, I can talk a bit about how the war's going, but it's not concluded yet, so we don't know what the outcome is. But in the next episode, I will talk about what's happened in the war, and some of the things that have happened internationally. I've briefly introduced some of the things I'll talk about, but there are, of course, some other things I would like to bring into this as well. So, good place to stop. I do apologise for the length. If you have managed to listen to all of this, well done, you, and also thank you. I hope this was useful, and I also hope I can actually start to be a bit more consistent with these again. I will definitely try and aim to keep the rest of these under 3 hours, but let's try and aim for under 2 hours. That would be easier for everyone, I believe. Yep. So I hope you enjoyed. Let me know what you think. There'll be some questions on Spotify, hopefully not on YouTube, but maybe leave a comment on YouTube or something. And yeah, I'll catch you for part 2.